A young man named Rust had just successfully filled another flask of distilled water, bringing the total number of flasks he'd completed for the day to 1,000. And with that, the quota is complete. Seeing he had finished his work before noon, Rust was pleased with himself. Distilled water is an indispensable ingredient, used for compounding various pharmaceuticals and transmuting magical creatures. His distilled water was special. He infused it with magical energy, making every single drop high quality. Just as he was about to spend the afternoon on his research, a hurried voice called his name. Recognizing the person as Rihalzam, Rust asked the reason for his visit. With a scornful look, the alchemist from the Combat Alchemy Division tried to restrain himself from starting a fight. Instead, he announced that the chairman was summoning Rust. Rihalzam would start an argument whenever he had the chance. As a proud member of the well-funded weapons division, he always complained about Rust's basic research division, claiming it wasn't worth the budget. As he carried the flask of distilled water away, Rihalzam jeered that an errand boy should just quietly do his duty and obey the summons. Rust headed to the chairman's office, where an unpleasant surprise awaited him. Rust's eyes widened, stunned as he heard the chairman announce that the basic research division's budget had been cut entirely down to zero. Since they only support other departments without producing tangible results, it's only natural to allocate the budget to departments that actually generate profit. Rust tried to object, but he didn't even get the chance. The decision to dissolve the department had already been made, and its members would be doing menial work for other researchers from now on. Annoyed, the chairman sarcastically remarked that Rust should be grateful he still had a job, puffing smoke from his pipe. The chairman told Rust to leave and get back to work. Come to think of it, even the pipe that man was using wouldn't exist without the basic research division. Seeing no reason to argue, Rust stormed out of the room. The technique for absorbing magical elements from the air was a joint project between his team and the engineering division. The heat conversion system, the solutions, and the circuit boards were all provided by his department. The idea that they didn't produce results was just the prejudice of the higher-ups who didn't really understand the actual work involved. Rust slumped into his desk, heavy with disappointment. He thought about how the budget and staff had been constantly cut ever since that man became chairman, and yet he had still done his job, proud that no recent successful product could have been made without his department's contributions. They all required the highest quality materials, and he was the one who prepared them. But even so, there was no point in talking to the chairman anymore if his department had already been dissolved. Just then, Rust received a message and the communication device began to move. This tool was a marvel of modern alchemy, and its basic materials were also supplied by his department. Looking at the message, he was suddenly swept up in a memory. The message was from a woman named Colin, whom Rust hadn't seen since they graduated from the academy. They had gotten along surprisingly well, and he still vividly remembered the crazy schemes she dragged him into, including turning a classroom into a jungle, always causing mischief that they often had to write apology letters together. After that, they both went their separate ways, but he'd heard she had distinguished herself in the last war. Now, reading the letter, Kalen wrote that he might find it rude of her to contact him so suddenly, but she got straight to the point. She had just been granted a territory on the frontier and needed his help to develop it. Two paths now lay before Rust. One was to stay at the guild and spend his life doing nothing but menial tasks, and the other was to accept her offer and an unwritten future. Remembering the face of his old friend, he quickly decided to quit and cheerfully follow Kalen. As he packed his belongings, Rust, a young alchemist, reflected on the attachment he had formed to this place after so long. Before the current chairman took over, the previous director, Wholehammer, was a self-made man who understood the importance of the basic research division, seeing it as the core foundation of the association. Rust and he had developed many products together, but a change in the government led to Wholehammer being demoted and replaced by a government official. When Rust reached the door of the main office, he overheard a conversation. The people inside were talking about the wise and easy decision to completely cut the basic research division's budget and transfer it all to the weapons alchemy division. They clearly weren't trying to keep their voices down, which annoyed Rust. Rust knocked and walked in without waiting for permission. Inside were the chairman and Rihalzam, both displeased by his sudden appearance. The chairman scolded Rust for entering without permission, and as the tense atmosphere grew, Rust calmly announced his resignation and turned to leave. Surprisingly, the two of them yelled out, arguing that he couldn't just quit like that. Rust turned back, asserted that he absolutely could, and presented his employment contract, which tied him to his job in the basic research division. According to the rules, he was supposed to train a replacement before leaving, but thanks to them, the division had been dissolved, allowing him to quit immediately. When they expressed concern about who would handle odd jobs in the production of distilled water, Rust simply told them to do it themselves. If they truly called themselves alchemists, Rust added that with their skill level, it shouldn't be a problem. The member from the weapons division looked annoyed, while the chairman sighed in relief, thinking it was good to be rid of a nuisance. After all, he had always believed they didn't need people like Rust. The chairman had intended to keep him on for menial tasks, but Rust's ungrateful attitude was unacceptable in the association. When Rust was told to leave, Rialzam was clearly a bit worried, while the chairman appeared indifferent. Rust refused their kind offer and left immediately. As he walked down the corridor, he came across a large painting, depicting a majestic creature bowing respectfully to a cloaked figure. This would probably be the last time he would ever see that painting. With this thought, he quietly thanked the painting for everything, and finally stepped out of the building. Outside, Rust took a deep breath, feeling an overwhelming sense of freedom for the first time in a long while. His lease had been canceled, and all his belongings were with him. Rust could head to Kalen's domain immediately. In a stylish move, he pulled out a parchment scroll, unfurled it, and activated a spell, reaching out his hand and summoning the necessary components. He called forth his mount, Hippopo, a cute, hippo-like creature perfect for long journeys. Climbing onto Hippopo's back, they eagerly set off and headed for the frontier. The domain Rust was headed to was in the far north of the country. After deciding to resign, Rust had contacted Kalen to inform her of his decision. As expected, she was thrilled to have him come and help. Rust didn't know what an ordinary alchemist like him could do to help, but as he hurried towards his destination, he looked around, realizing it had been a long time since he'd been outside. Before going into the forest to find ingredients was a daily routine. It felt wonderful to smell the freshly bloomed flowers and feel the cool breeze once again. Filled with joy, he realized he had been carrying so much stress over the past few years. Now, having left the association, he had more free time and could even stop to gather some ingredients like before. As he was about to approach the lake, the mark on Hippopo's ear began to glow, pulsing repeatedly. A clear sign that something was wrong. From the signal, it was highly likely that there was an injured person nearby, and Rust proceeded with caution. Rust urged his horse into the forest and saw a person lying ahead. He quickly dismounted to help and told Hippopo to stay alert. Setting foot on the grass, he surveyed his surroundings. If the person were by the roadside, it could be a bandit feigning injury. But that was unlikely, as almost no one passed through here. Moving closer, he realized the person on the ground was a dark cleric, a rare sight. Based on her uniform, she seemed to be a follower of the goddess of vengeance. Looking at her flushed, pained face, Rust realized she was probably suffering from a high fever, and was also unconscious. Come to think of it, he remembered there were some herbs nearby that could be used to reduce fever, which was probably why she had come to this area. Rust wondered if she knew that. First, he needed to ensure her airway was clear and check her general condition. Apologizing silently, he gently turned her over. To his surprise, he saw markings on her cheek and forehead, patterns that usually indicated the presence of a curse. As he watched her condition worsened, Rust activated a magic scroll from before, and began the process of transcribing the magic onto the fallen dark cleric. The scroll hovered over her body, and quickly completed scanning her condition. He commanded it to display the results, and the parchment was instantly covered in various formulas and texts. Rust was certain that someone had placed a curse on this girl. Though it wasn't critical, it would be best to take her to a specialist. But seeing her pained face, he knew he couldn't wait any longer. Taking a closer look, Rust realized the fever was due to poisoning. The wound on her side was likely where the poison entered her body. It was a special type of poison, likely inflicted by an enemy's familiar. He didn't have the right kind of potion on hand to deal with it, but with the forest's abundant resources, Rust decided to concoct a new dose himself. After asking Hippopo to watch over the girl, he hurried off to find the ingredients. After just a few minutes of searching, he was already exhausted, but his face was still set with determination. Rust sighed, realizing that years of inactivity were starting to leave their uncomfortable mark. Fortunately, he had anticipated this and prepared a few stamina potions, which instantly banished his fatigue the moment he drank one. When he reached the nearby lake, he saw there were still some medicinal herbs left, but the area where they grew seemed to have shrunk. Rust wondered if someone had been harvesting them regularly, but then remembered he was in a hurry. There were herbs here for restoring stamina, aiding in wound regeneration and detoxification. On their own, they weren't very effective, even after normal processing. Russ knew that the potency of potions made from these herbs wouldn't be much better. Thinking it over, he realized that even if the Dark Cleric had made it here, she probably couldn't have saved herself. But in her case, a simple transmutation process from him would be enough. Besides, he had an entire lake to use as a raw material. Using a transmutation process focused on speed, the talented alchemist quickly and skillfully got to work. He activated multiple magic scrolls at once, and effortlessly performed complex formulas simultaneously. With practiced ease, he released the force of gravity, designated 5 targets, and created a sphere of water that levitated before him. Rust began the purification process, a method similar to how he created distilled water. To aid in production, he had cleverly crafted a magic scroll, as doing it otherwise would be too troublesome. Even so, he was always proud of it, as it was one of the best creations from his basic research department. Super purified water went far beyond ordinary purified water, but Rust took it a step further. Absolutely pure water. The sphere of water was filtered through a magic slate, making it even purer. Though it was just water, its production required a few special techniques, including activating a scroll. Fortunately, after making 1,000 flasks a day, the process was second nature to Rust. Rust had to make adjustments to ensure optimal purity, as highly pure liquids easily dissolve other materials. When the medicinal herbs were added to the absolutely pure water, to maintain balance, the water would break down and absorb the components from the herbs. After performing one final purification, Rust held a concentrated elixir in his hand. Nearly finished, he took out a third scroll, fixing the position of this golden elixir in the world. Finally, he partially loosened the gravitational force, allowing the liquid to flow smoothly into a small vial. It was a freshly made elixir, completely free of impurities. Satisfied with the result, Rust quickly returned to the injured woman. When he arrived, Rust saw Hippopos stomping its feet urgently on the ground, as if it were searching for something. From a distance, he could see a small, dark shadow darting about. The large beast lifted its 2 front legs and brought them crashing down on a single spot over and over again. The sight terrified Rust, who wondered what the target was. He waited for the attack to pass, then ran over to see what had happened. Looking where Hippopo had pointed, Rust saw a dark puddle, possibly the sign of some kind of familiar. This can't be a coincidence. That thing is most likely hunting the cursed woman. Though the immediate threat had passed, Rust quickly got to work treating her wound. But first, he politely asked for permission. Rust poured completely pure water onto her body. Even though she was still unconscious, the sparkling droplets began to take effect, completely healing the gash on her side. Now healed, she slowly began to stir. As consciousness returned, the Dark Nun immediately took a battle stance, ready to fight. She asked where the enemy was, her hand still gripping her sword tightly. Rust pointed to the tracks of the familiar behind her. She looked around cautiously, then demanded to know who he was. Rust almost introduced himself as a member of the association, but he stopped himself and said he was a traveling alchemist. He almost fell back into old habits, but this new way felt lighter, freer. Remembering he was currently unemployed, Rust couldn't explain any further, and the woman collapsed again. Rust quickly apologized for healing her without permission, but also reminded her not to move too much as the poison was still in her system. Gently, he offered her the rest of the potion. Instead of drinking it right away, she looked at him with gratitude and thanked him for saving her life first. Then, hesitantly, she earnestly asked how much the potion would cost. She had likely misunderstood, thinking he was starting her treatment only to demand payment before finishing. Although he understood that providing free treatment could arouse suspicion, he remained calm and patiently explained. Rust reassured her that he had no ulterior motives, and simply thought it would be easier for her to drink the potion when she was fully conscious. With a bright smile, she sincerely apologized, saying it was her mistake to have doubted him. Looking into his eyes, she could feel the sincerity in his words. Even so, she couldn't help but recognize that the potion was clearly expensive, and she couldn't accept it for free. Understanding her feelings, he thought for a moment before proposing an alternative. He reintroduced himself. Rust, a traveling merchant on his way to the northern border. For payment, he suggested a contract where she would agree to help if their lands ever faced a catastrophe. With a gentle gesture, he made his good-willed offer. Rust politely asked for the knight's name, since he was about to give her such a valuable potion. Moved by this arrangement, she raised her sword high and introduced herself as Taula, a knight of Arisla, the goddess of vengeance, and the third of the 3 swords. Accepting the debt of gratitude, she solemnly swore on her sword that its blade would cut through any misfortune that befell him. Rust, feeling she was taking this much more seriously than he had intended, simply smiled and handed her the potion. As Tola drank the liquid, a gentle warmth spread through her body, and a powerful energy surged within her. Sensing that something had changed, she immediately drew her sword and held it before her. Her eyes were fixed on the gleaming steel, as if the sword itself spoke of a new power. Tola realized her face was no longer tainted by the marks of the curse. Tears began to fall, and she trembled with this newfound sense of freedom. Rust looked away, embarrassed, while Tola explained that she had tried all kinds of holy water, but none of them had worked. In truth, lifting the curse was merely a side effect of the potion. The liquid Rust used was completely pure, no different from regular water. In other words, it was like primordial water, the original water created by the gods, infused with sacred properties, making it far more effective than any holy water. However, Rust didn't want to tell her that the recovery she had long hoped for was actually just a side effect. Rust had to hurry on his way to Kalen's domain, as she would surely have many questions for him. With that, he climbed onto Hippopo and continued his journey, only saying that he had business to attend to. Tola tried to stop him, but they were already dashing off at full speed. Left alone, Tola stared intently at the vial, and wondered if this golden potion was the legendary elixir she had heard of. Unexpectedly, Tola now found herself indebted to an extraordinary person. Feeling overjoyed by this turn of events, the Shadow Priestess was eager to use her skills to face any disaster he might encounter. Remembering that Rust was heading north, she turned to continue her own mission. The sooner she could complete her revenge, the sooner Tola could head north herself. After everything was settled, the two parted ways, each going their own separate way. In every field, the basics are always the essential foundation, playing a major role in the pursuit of results in this world. After all, how many people truly understand this fundamental principle? At the end of a long day's journey through the forest, Rust and Hippopo stopped to rest in a spot where they could see the brilliant stars. After parting with Tola, he continued north. Making a campfire at night and gazing at the stars felt fresher than ever. Since joining the association, his nights away from home had all been spent in the lab, diligently concocting until morning. Following the directions on the map, they seemed to be approaching the last village before the northern border. Just then, Hippopo nuzzled up to him, trying to take a bite of his food. In reality, it was a solidified pill, an original recipe of his, consisting of various grains and dried fruits that Kalung used to call a grass brick. However, the taste wasn't all that bad. With such a short distance left, they could hope to reach the village by tomorrow afternoon. Sure enough, the next day, they arrived at Toma village. As he looked around, he saw that the whole area looked like a barren settlement. Since this was the neighboring village of a friend, Rust wondered if the village was all right, and decided to stop and check things out now that he was here. Rust thanked Hippopo and recalled it to the scroll. The image of his companion gradually shrank, flickering, before finally returning to the form of a rolled-up piece of parchment. Just then, a man appeared from behind and coldly asked who he was. Though slightly startled, Rust introduced himself, emphasizing that he was a traveling alchemist. Hearing his profession, the man immediately interrupted him and urgently requested that he see the village chief, then led him deeper into the village. They passed by broken signs, abandoned houses, and overgrown weeds everywhere. The entire area looked desolate, as if entire families had left. A short while later, they arrived at a house that was still kept clean and filled with sunlight. Seeing Kagero branches at the entrance, Rust wondered if there was a tree nearby and if this was the village chief's house. The man knocked on the door and called out, announcing that he had brought an alchemist. An old man leaning on a cane stepped out and asked if he was a real alchemist. The villager admitted he hadn't checked carefully, but said that Rust looked like an alchemist by his demeanor. Rust introduced himself properly, then presented his alchemist medallion, which bore the symbol of a scale. The medallion glistened in the light, drawing the eyes of those around as they took a closer look. The old man's eyes widened in surprise, and he introduced himself as Toma, the village chief. The medal on Rust's chest wasn't just proof of his profession, but also showed he belonged to the highest ranks. Still, Rust had never given it much thought since most people in the association had a similar medal, including Rialzam, the one in charge. Village Chief Toma apologized in case anyone in the village had unintentionally offended him, and then mentioned he had a favor to ask. He invited Rust into his home for tea, and Rust was sure the request would be related to the village's decline. Besides, the fact that the village chief knew to call him master showed he was quite knowledgeable. Inside, Rust felt the conversation would go rather smoothly. A woman brought them tea, which was ordinary enough, but after days of eating only preserved rations, having a warm drink was a truly pleasant change. After a short while, they got to the heart of the matter. They asked Rust if he had any old-type magic crystals. Thinking for a moment, he replied that he could help them with that. However, he wondered why they would want such old types of crystals. Village Chief Toma reminded Rust about the effects of the magic gun reforms, which took place during last year's war. Rust vaguely remembered that, particularly how Rielzam was always bragging that it was his own accomplishment. Apparently, the technology had been improved by others, but the man from earlier complained that the improvement was in name only, and had really just become a blatant way to rip off customers. Village Chief Toma calmed Zal down, but told him to continue his explanation. In front of him were two guns, an old model and a new one. For people like them living in remote areas with no military training, these weapons were vital tools for defending themselves against monsters and beasts. However, everything changed a year ago. The old models were fuel-efficient and durable, only needing an occasional reload, and were considered the best companions for people in these remote regions. They placed the H-32 in front of him, a model developed several years ago, renowned for its durability and reliable accuracy. As he held it in his hands, Rust recalled the tool's history. The association began developing this gun right around the time he joined, and his master Halhammer was the one who led the project. He was the head of the weaponsmithing department back then. The slogan for the H-32 back then was, "Peace of mind for soldiers," until the very end. Still, some critics complained that its simple durability and low fuel consumption were too mundane. However, it seemed the people who actually used it appreciated it immensely. The R001, on the other hand, was completely different. They advertised the R001 as cutting-edge technology, but Zale bluntly called it worse than junk. His words were harsh, but he was spot on. The new models had improved power, but they broke easily and were prone to misfiring. The worst part was their terrible fuel consumption, forcing users to constantly replace the very expensive magic crystals. This change was completely unnecessary, as the old models were already plenty powerful. The biggest problem was that when they stopped making the H-32 gun, they also stopped producing the old-type magic crystals. Even though they still used their H-32s, no one produced the old crystals anymore. This forced them to buy the useless new models, which were too expensive to operate and unreliable for self-defense. To top it all off, the new magic crystals could even shatter, making their situation completely desperate. They only used the guns when absolutely necessary, but every time they fired, there was a high chance it would malfunction or break. With all those problems combined, the threats from monsters and wild beasts were on the rise, especially in remote villages. Families with children were especially afraid, so much so that many had already moved to safer places. Seeing that Rust understood their plight, they asked if he could provide them with old-type magic crystals. Unfortunately, he didn't have any on hand. Disappointment was clear on their faces. They couldn't hide their genuine reaction. Immediately after, Rust offered to make the crystals for them. Surprise and joy washed over them, and they thanked him profusely. Looking at them, Rust wondered if what he'd just said was really that surprising. Next, Rust brought up the subject of payment for his work. The mention of payment made them both a little nervous, but with a hopeful glint in their eyes, they carefully asked for the details. Rust requested a reasonable amount of Kagero material, which left the two of them speechless in confused silence, not understanding why he would want such a thing. Many Kagero plants grew in this area, but to the villagers, they were practically worthless. Rust was pleased to hear there were many trees. There was an old custom of decorating the village chief's shop with Kagero trees, but fewer and fewer villages and towns were growing them these days. However, according to ancient texts, there was always at least one tree in every village. With that in mind, Rust asked them to take him to where the Kagero trees grew, adding that this was also the time of year they bore fruit. They left the house and headed to their destination together. Toma led the way, but Rust was surprised to see the rest of the villagers suddenly following behind them. You couldn't blame them. In a small village with so few forms of entertainment, there wasn't much for even the children to do. They soon arrived at the Kagero forest, which was full of vibrant trees. Rust asked his two companions to gather some materials from the trees, adding that they could just pick up any that had already fallen to the ground. Village Chief Toma turned to the crowd that had followed them and instructed them to help gather branches and fruit. A short while later, a pile of thin branches and spiky fruits was neatly arranged in front of him. As they probably already knew, magic crystals are usually made from magic stones taken from monsters, but that wasn't the only way. Rust took out 3 scrolls and activated them all at once, causing a sudden burst of energy to radiate around him. The villagers buzzed at the sight of the glowing scrolls, some gasping in surprise. They were amazed as they watched Rust work, with a few whispering that only master alchemists could create such things with secret techniques. And what was even more impressive was how he activated them all at once. Hearing this, Rust realized they knew a little about alchemy, and briefly considered putting on an impressive performance. Despite the thought, this repetitive process had become quite mechanical for him by now. The scrolls expanded around Rust, elemental plates hovering around him, glowing in the dense forest. A moment later, a portion of the energy gathered in front of one of the scrolls, and Rust used the invention he was most proud of to process the magical elements in the air. Magic stones taken from monsters are actually elements in the air that have condensed over a long period, so if he could filter them directly from the air, there would be no need to collect them from monsters. Before him were precious magical elements in an extremely high concentration. The others watched intently, clearly not understanding what was happening, but still immensely curious and amazed. This made perfect sense because the purification scroll was Rust's own invention, and only he knew how to use it. This was the key to this unique refinement process. Rust picked up a Kagero fruit and threw it into the gathering energy. Kagero fruits were often used in many refinement processes, as they were excellent at containing magical elements. Using another scroll, he began to polish the Kagero fruit. Immediately, the magical elements swirled around the fruit, forming a small but powerful vortex. The villagers gasped in amazement, cheering at the sight of the vortex, as the concept was now easier to understand seeing it with their own eyes. This time, the reaction was even bigger. When Rust threw the Kagero fruit, now filled with magical elements, into the vortex, something miraculous happened. One of the factors that determines the quality of a magic crystal is how it's cut. Of course, the purification scroll didn't just create a vortex. Its secret lay in the ultra-fine particles within, which could change the density of the diamond dust and the speed of rotation. Rust controlled every minute adjustment, and after a sufficient amount of time, he decided it was time to increase the density of the diamond dust. With just a wave of his hand, the vortex grew larger and shone more brilliantly. Seeing this, the women in the crowd were entranced, wondering what sort of miracle was happening right before them. Rust found it amusing that no matter where he went, ladies were always fascinated by shiny things. There are 3 standards for magic crystals: size, output, and capacity. In particular, the size and output must be suitable for it to function, and the output is determined by how the crystal is cut. Luckily, he still clearly remembered the standards for old-style magic crystals. Focusing intently, he carefully made adjustments to ensure it wasn't too small. When all the adjustments were complete, he fixed it in place and finished his work. With the power of the 3 purification scrolls, the magical elements were completely sealed within the Kagero fruit, and the refinement process was complete. Now, in the palm of his hand, was a shining magic crystal, the result of all his hard work. Rust was satisfied with its quality. Clenching the magic crystal in his hand, Rust declared it complete. With the newly created crystal, Rust handed the old-style gun to village chief Toma and told him he could test out the crystal. The village chief slotted the crystal into the gun, and as the villagers watched with eager anticipation, he raised the gun to the sky. A deafening blast echoed, unleashing a powerful beam of light that pierced the sky. The villagers cheered with joy, for they no longer had to live in fear of the monsters. Seeing everyone so happy, Rust continued with his alchemy. He once again summoned 3 purification scrolls to float around him. Rust astounded those around him with his brilliant alchemy skills. In just a short time, he had created countless crystals, filling up large baskets. After catching his breath, he invited the villagers to come and take the baskets filled with crystals, announcing that the stones he crafted would be twice as durable as the commercially available ones. Everyone was stunned by that claim. Village Chief Toma was so moved that he began to mumble about having too many crystals and not knowing what to do with them all. Seeing his reaction, Rust smiled. The chief quickly regained his composure and spoke to Rust in a calmer voice. Village Chief Toma, more surprised than he had ever been in his life, turned to his assistant Zala and told him to take the magic crystals back to the village. Zale quickly complied. Meanwhile, Rust saw the many bags of Kagero materials he had requested. As the villagers were trying to tie up the Kagero bags with ropes, Rust gently told them that it wasn't necessary. He summoned another spell, creating a whirlwind that sucked all the Kagero materials into his backpack like a vacuum cleaner. The onlookers were once again astounded by this high-level magic technique. Afterwards, Rust turned to the village chief and said he had something to discuss. Knowing this conversation required more privacy, the chief agreed to lead him somewhere more secluded. Village Chief Toma said he would take Rust to his home. Rust recognized the old man's perceptiveness, as he immediately understood the importance of the upcoming discussion. After a productive day, the tea he was drinking seemed to taste better than ever. The village chief, in a state of anticipation, listened to Rust's every word. Noticing he was a bit tense, Rust tried to lighten the atmosphere. He reminded the chief that with the current supply of magic crystals, they wouldn't need any more for years, if not decades. However, Rust added that he wasn't satisfied yet, as there were still many other villages in need of help. This made the chief realize that Rust's work didn't just end here but would extend to other places. Rust began to speak about the importance of using old-style magic crystals, especially in remote regions. Village Chief Toma agreed, which made it easy for Rust to transition to what he really wanted to discuss. With a serious expression, Rust brought up the possibility of establishing a business relationship with Crystal's new territory, called the Dominion of the Night, to supply old-style magic crystals. The mention of Colin immediately caught the village chief's attention, who instantly recalled her reputation as a powerful swordswoman, capable of felling 3 armored men with a single swing, despite her small arms. The chief began to elaborate on Kaylin's fame and seemed about to reveal her well-known nickname. But before he could, Rust held up a hand to stop him, saying that he was a friend of Kaylin's, and would soon be heading to her domain. Rust's restraint made the chief take notice, sensing the connection and serious purpose in his words. Rust thought about the girl's crude nickname and felt it dehumanized her. Since this was a rather sensitive topic, he encouraged Village Chief Toma to keep this conversation confidential and to report back to the Lord of the Land. He stressed that establishing a new domain like Crystal's was a very costly endeavor. Rust, with his foresight, envisioned a business partnership for producing old-style magic crystals between Crystals and the villages. He believed this would benefit all parties involved. Given the current situation, Rust was confident that Crystals and the Lord would reach a favorable agreement, while Toma Village and its chief could be content with the magic crystals they had already received. After careful consideration, Rust believed this plan would pave the way for a long and sustainable partnership. Village Chief Toma agreed to Rust's request, and the young man decided to send a letter to an acquaintance at the academy, whom he believed was still serving in the military. Rust figured this letter would lay the groundwork for his plan. Based on what he knew of Rialzam, Rust was certain that he would interfere in the coming events. However, what worried him more was how the military would react when they realized their production of new-style magic crystals was about to face a major obstacle. As he finished the letter, Rust rolled up the paper and dripped hot wax onto it, and used his alchemist's metal to seal it. With his work in Toma Village finished, he prepared to continue his journey. Rust figured it was about time to set off. The chief of Toma Village offered to let him stay the night, but he politely declined. Seeing that Rust was preparing to leave, villagers from all around expressed their disappointment, wishing he could stay longer to help with their other minor issues. The village was filled with bright faces and waving hands as everyone wished Rust well on his journey. As he continued his journey with Hipapo, he braced himself, as these wild areas were teeming with monsters. Suddenly, a creature with a long tongue lunged forward to attack Rust and Hipapo, but immediately Hipapo, with its enormous size, stomped down hard, stopping the slithering creature in a crushing blow. Even so, Rust was always a kind person, not letting the danger affect his spirits. Rust thanked his adorable pet, Hipapo, for a job well done. He bent down to examine the creature flattened under Hipapo's massive footprint. Putting on a pair of harvesting gloves, he took out a waterproof bag to collect a sample, hoping it would be useful as an ingredient for something. Based on his knowledge, Rust knew this area was home to many monsters, since normal animals couldn't compete with them. This thought brought a smug smile to his face, ready for the interesting research ahead. He pulled out his map, realizing he was near a body of water, which signaled that he would soon arrive at Kaylin's location. A short while later, having reached the pond, Rust dismounted from Hipapo to see if any other types of monsters lived around the water. Hipapo made a sound to warn Rust. Observing the water's surface more closely, Rust noticed traces of magical element. Suddenly, something shot up from under the water, splashing him in the face. Surprised, he realized it was a small lizard. Looking at the harmless-looking white lizard, Rust remarked on its rare coloring. Just then, another creature with a long tongue or tentacle emerged from the pond, narrowly missing Rust. It turned out this creature had wrapped around the lizard's tail and was trying to pull it back in. Rust met the lizard's innocent and pleading eyes. He thought rationally, telling himself that even though the creature looked like a juvenile, that didn't mean it actually was one. The only thing he was sure of right now was that it too was clearly some kind of monster. Even knowing that the lizard's innocent appearance could just be a defense mechanism to trick other creatures, Rust couldn't remain calm looking into its eyes. Unable to stop himself from feeling pity for the small creature, he summoned Hippopo to help. The giant hippopo leaped into the air, casting a large shadow over the lizard. As his pet landed, the powerful stomp snapped the tentacle in two, freeing the lizard. As the monster retreated back into the water, Rust approached the lizard and saw that it was now too weak to move. He also picked up the severed piece of the tentacle, hoping it could be used as an ingredient. Rust placed a magical scroll to hover over the lizard to see if he could analyze it. Since the creature wasn't human, getting an accurate reading proved difficult. Rust also theorized that something was preventing him from gathering complete information, but from what he could read, he proceeded with his experiment cautiously. Rust noted that the lizard was suffering from severe exhaustion. He hypothesized that its mitochondria might not be functioning at full capacity. While he pondered how to treat the lizard, Hippopo was still in the water, continuing its fight with the tentacled monster. Unable to fully understand the lizard's condition, Rust could only concoct a simple potion. In the time it took him to make the medicine, Hippopo had dragged the main, unconscious body of the tentacled creature out for him to examine. Rust applied the medicine to the lizard, but it still hadn't woken up, though the activity of its mitochondria seemed to have improved. While considering other options, Rust noticed Hippopo showing compassion and caring for the little lizard, something he rarely saw his pet do towards potentially dangerous creatures. Rust wondered if this little lizard might be a special creature, not just an ordinary monster. Either way, he couldn't just leave it behind, because he knew there was a high chance it would be attacked by other monsters drawn to the water. Deciding to take the lizard with him on his journey, Rust continued along the river connected to the pond, map in hand. Before long, he saw the crystals camp in the distance. Immediately, Hippopo became alert and stopped, which Rust quickly noticed. He dismounted from Hippopo, his feet landing on the sandy ground, and took out his medallion. Rust formally introduced himself as a master rank alchemist, the one Colin had been waiting for. Suddenly, the sand in front of him erupted, and from it emerged two identical women with talismans obscuring their faces. One of them formally addressed him by the title of Master, and apologized for their reception, explaining that they had to be cautious because of monsters capable of convincingly disguising themselves as humans. Rust realized that Hippopo had stopped before they entered the women's attack range, a testament to Hippopo's sharp instincts. Rust told the sisters there was no need to apologize and that, on the contrary, he was impressed by their sophisticated concealment. Even so, the sisters didn't consider themselves skilled, as they assumed Rust, a master alchemist, had easily spotted them from the very beginning. Looking at him, they understood why their mistress, Kaylin, held Rust in such high regard. He noticed the charms on the sisters' heads, and grew curious about the story behind them. Suddenly, one of the women looked closer and realized there was a monster on Hippopo, putting them on high alert. The two sisters began to argue with each other, with the younger sister, Roa, protesting against provoking Rust, arguing that they couldn't defeat him or Hippopo. The older sister, Ari, apologized for Roa's behavior, trying to de-escalate the situation. In the meantime, Rust was just thinking how lucky he was to have avoided a pointless battle right after arriving. Rust silently wondered if these two sisters had abilities related to clairvoyance. He deduced that Roa, the younger one, might have farsight, while Ari, the older one, seemed to have the ability to gauge the strength of others. Noticing that the little lizard on Hippopo had put them on guard, Rust swore on his alchemist medallion that the creature posed no threat. He hoped that would ease the sisters' concerns. Rust affirmed that he would take full responsibility for the small creature. The sisters, Roa and Ari, agreed, and then led him to see Lady Kaylin. A short while later, they arrived at a large tent, inside of which was a massive communication center, where people were bustling about with various tasks. A figure appeared and called out Rust's name. It was Kaylin, who was incredibly excited to see her friend had arrived. Their handshake was so heartfelt it was as if sparks flew, shattering any expectations of Kaylin's reputation. Instead of a tall, fearsome warrior, Rust found Kaylin to be quite petite. She asked him about his journey, as if expecting something, and quickly asked if he'd had any trouble with the sisters, Roa and Ari. Rust was confused when Kaylin revealed she had intentionally sent Roa and Ari to greet him. He hadn't realized it was a deliberate act. Rust quickly understood that Kaylin had chosen them knowing they were the most likely to give him trouble in their outpost. He reflected on how Kaylin always intentionally created conflict right from the start, but with the goal of laying the groundwork for a relationship, albeit in a somewhat clumsy way. Rust a bit awkwardly reassured Colin that he had no problem dealing with Roa and Ari, which Kaylin was very pleased to hear. Wanting to speak privately with her old friend, Kaylin asked everyone else in the room to leave and get some rest. Only Kaylin and Rust were left in the tent, ready for an important exchange. Rust and the two sisters, Roa and Ari, were still inside. Seeing that a table was needed for their conversation, Kaylin, with astonishing strength, hoisted a heavy piece of equipment with just one hand, causing cracks to appear on its surface. This couldn't help but remind Rust that, despite her small frame, Kaylin's extraordinary strength hadn't changed a bit. After clearing the area, a satisfied Kaylin told the two sisters to fetch some tea for her and her guest. As night fell, everyone left the tent, leaving only Rust and Kaylin behind. Rust guessed they were about to discuss the troubles plaguing the outpost, which Kaylin confirmed. With a playful tone, Rust mentioned he had come here under the impression he'd be given a nice, comfortable job, making Kaylin laugh at his remark. As Kaylin told Rust about the upcoming mission, she explained that she hadn't summoned him just to handle trivial matters. Affectionately, she called him by his nickname, the Academy's Genius, which made Rust cringe and ask her to stop using that name, wanting to get straight to the point. The atmosphere shifted, growing more tense. Kaylin announced that she wanted Rust, the newly arrived alchemist, to investigate the disease spreading through the camp and discover its origin. After the meeting, Rust stepped outside and took a walk around the camp, his mind preoccupied with the local illness he was tasked with investigating. As he tried to reflect more on the matter, Rust noticed the dagger-like stares of those around him fixed on him. He tried waving and smiling, but the glares didn't waver. Rust decided that in addition to his main mission, he also wanted to earn the trust of the people in the camp. The sisters Roa and Ari led Rust to his tent. After noticing the distrust from the camp's residents, Rust felt lucky to have met the two sisters first. However, he quickly took that thought back when they bluntly told him they didn't trust him either. They even declared that they would not forgive him if he failed to live up to the high expectations Lady Kaylin had for him. Stepping into his tent, Rust was surprised by its immense size. He silently made a comparison, realizing Kaylin must hold him in high regard and have great expectations for him. From an overhead view, Rust's tent was even larger than the surrounding ones, as if to send a message to everyone about his importance. Looking inside, he saw that no furniture or amenities had been prepared, just as he'd expected from his old friend's personality. Rust just smiled, understanding this was Kaylin's way of making him set things up himself and get right to work. Rust took out a scroll to prepare to receive the patients that Ari and Roa were about to bring in. With his magic, he summoned a purified mat that was resistant to water and dirt to protect his work area. He gently placed the small lizard on a little piece of cloth to rest. Next, Rust pulled a special scroll from his pouch and activated its magic, summoning an alchemical creature named Rose. Though it looked like a rose, Rose was actually an alchemical creature. Just like Hippopo, Rust asked Rose to create a sturdy nest for the small lizard. The magic activated, and Rose used vines from its own body to build a beautiful nest for the little creature. Rust thanked Rose and went on to ask it to build the standard furnishings for the tent. Rose began creating a bed, a desk, and various other things Rust would need to prepare for his upcoming mission. His tent was quickly furnished, transforming into a comfortable and operational space. Rust explained that Rose was an alchemical creature he had created back when he was a student at the academy. The creature was especially useful during field investigations, when he had to be away for long periods. Rose was so efficient that it brought back fond memories of when other students, especially Kaylin, would often gather in his tent to take advantage of the comfort it provided. One of the two sisters came in, announcing that they had brought a patient. Rust was ready and told her to bring the patient in. The patient began to describe his symptoms, saying that he always felt tired and sluggish. Listening carefully, Rust quickly realized that he could diagnose and treat the symptoms of all the patients within a single day. He got to work, using his skills and knowledge to help the people in the camp, one by one. Rust hoped that treating many patients would help him find the root cause of the disease spreading through the camp. As he saw more patients, he began to gather data and quickly realized the illness was more serious than he had initially predicted. After treating patient after patient, time flew by and day had turned to night. Roa was surprised by Rust's speed as she saw he was already on his last patient. Listening to the last patient describe his symptoms, Rust began to prepare a medicine for him. As he activated his magic to finish the potion, he thought about how everything he was doing was just treating the symptoms for now. Finishing the concoction, Rust handed the potion to the patient. Determined to continue his search for the true cause of the illness, Russ knew he needed to identify the root cause of the disease to truly solve the problem. As he drank the medicine, the patient was surprised to find that the numbness in his hand vanished instantly. Overjoyed, the young patient thanked Rust with deep gratitude, calling him a doctor. Rust felt happy seeing the patient so pleased, as he had never received this kind of gratitude for his potions when he worked at the guild. Now, with no patients left, Rust thanked Ro for her help throughout the day, but she simply replied that it was her job. However, Rust offered Roa a potion, saying it was for fatigue, a kind gesture that Roa didn't expect. This left her momentarily flustered, but she could also sense the young man's sincerity. Rust explained that he had brewed the potion during a break between patients, which made Roa thank him genuinely. Before running off to her next task, Rust told himself that breaking the ice and building trust with the people in the camp wouldn't be easy. Once he was alone, he prepared to finish compiling the day's information. He unrolled a scroll to write his report for Kalen, reviewing the notes he'd collected from the patients' histories. With the goal of continuing his work, Rust stepped out of the tent, ready to seize the opportunity to discuss the magic crystals. The people in the camp, seeing him emerge, greeted him with smiles, a stark contrast to the suspicious glances he'd received when he first arrived. Their attitude had clearly changed as they thanked him for treating everyone in a single day. As Rust walked by, they waved at him, which made him feel more at ease. Rust headed toward Kalen's tent, stopping at the entrance and telling the guard that he needed to see her about work. Rust entered the tent after the guard granted him permission, carrying his report. Inside, Kalen greeted him with a smile, unable to hide her surprise that the alchemist had treated the entire camp in just half a day. As she looked over Rust's report, the atmosphere became more relaxed, and she was generous with her praise for his talent. However, as she read deeper into what he had written, Kalen's tone shifted, becoming more serious. She looked up at her old friend and thanked him sincerely for saving her people. Rust knelt before Kalen, understanding that her brief words held deep gratitude. Suddenly his stomach rumbled, breaking the solemn atmosphere. Kalen couldn't hold back her laughter, realizing that Rust hadn't eaten much all day. Kalen laughed and promised to get him a proper meal after his hard day's work, while Rust scratched his head in embarrassment, just smiling at the funny situation. The talk of food sent Kalen into another fit of laughter when she realized her old friend was still eating the same grass blocks he did back when they were students. As they waited for the meal to be brought, Kalen asked Rust to tell her more about his report. The next morning, Rust went about his morning routine and noticed the little lizard was still asleep. He stepped outside and saw the two sisters, Roa and Ahri, waiting for him. Rust asked them how long they had been waiting and how they were feeling. The two sisters replied that they felt great, all thanks to the medicine you gave them. They even remarked that his medicine was extremely effective at getting rid of fatigue. Rust was happy to hear that, feeling pleased that his hard work had paid off. Lady Colin asked the sisters, Roa and Ahri, to give Rust a tour of the camp. They asked him where he wanted to go first, and after a moment of thought, Rust asked to be taken to the food storage area. To make things easier, he summoned Hippopo, which excited the two sisters when they realized they would get to ride it. The group quickly arrived at the food warehouse, a place that looked like a semi-underground cellar with a large, closed gate. Rust, with his keen senses, guessed that this place might have once been a monster's den, later converted into a food storage. Rust asked Hippopo to warn him if it detected anything unusual, while he looked for the necessary scroll in his bag. He tossed a scroll into the air, summoning the mystical dowsing pendulum, letting it hang suspended from his hand. Rust explained to Roa and Ahri that this dowsing pendulum was a tool for measuring magical elements, and the wider its swing, the more abundant the magical elements were in that area. Rust began to walk around the area outside the food warehouse, paying attention to how the pendulum reacted. When he reached a specific area, the pendulum started to swing more strongly, causing Rust to focus his attention there. Rust knelt down, watching the dowsing pendulum swing even more violently, signaling that the magic underground was so concentrated it could sterilize any bacteria that came near. He looked over at Hippopo, who was trying to find something on the ground, and noticed Roa was also bent over, helping with the investigation. Rust continued to follow the direction the pendulum indicated, checking what was displayed on his scroll. He discovered that the magic was highly concentrated anywhere in this area, but there was nothing unusual in sight. He began to ponder. Food is usually stored in cellars because of the dark and cold environment, and also because these places often have high levels of magic, which helps preserve food better by preventing bacteria. However, with this preservation method, Rust found it hard to believe that the illness in the camp could have come from the food. This only strengthened his resolve to thoroughly investigate the real cause. Rust thought that the illness might have originated from the monster that used to live in this den. He asked Roa what kind of monster used to be here, and she replied that it was a bear. Rust was about to ask for more details, but was interrupted when a man approached. Roa introduced the newcomer as the person in charge of managing the food supplies. The food manager was delighted to meet Rust and thanked him for treating his younger brother, who had been suffering from numb hands. He shook Rust's hand firmly and said he was ready to assist him in any way he could. Rust thanked him for his enthusiasm. When Rust asked if he could inspect the inside of the warehouse, the manager immediately agreed. Inside, Rust used the dowsing pendulum and followed the direction of its swing to guide him, hoping to find something unusual that could explain the cause of the illness in the camp. Rust carefully reviewed his findings and saw that all the stored food was in good condition, with no traces of poison. With this conclusion, he decided there was no need to stay in the cellar any longer. As he stepped out of the warehouse, Rust asked Hipopo if it had detected anything unusual, but even Hipopo hadn't found anything. Roa and Ari asked if they could assume that the illness didn't originate from the food storage, and Rust replied that he couldn't be 100% sure, but for now, they needed to continue investigating. Rust decided to check another place, specifically the water purification jug, which held the drinking and cooking water for the camp. Observing the jug, Rust realized it was an old magic item, with a purification function that still worked perfectly. Still, he didn't think it was the cause of the illness, especially since the paralysis symptom didn't match anything the jug could possibly affect. Rust had checked both the food and water supplies, but he still couldn't find any real answers. As he was lost in thought, one of the sisters suddenly suggested that he take a break to eat. Rust jumped, startled by how close her face was to his when she spoke, which gave him a little scare. She explained that she had to get that close because he never notices anything when he's concentrating. As the group started heading to the dining hall, Rust kept thinking about how she'd gotten his attention, feeling that her approach was completely unnatural. He turned to ask the sisters if Kaylin had asked them to make sure he ate. Even though neither of them answered, Rust could easily tell that Kaylin had put them up to it. Memories of the old days came flooding back, of how Kaylin always worried about him in her own peculiar way. Rust could only smile and accept the thoughtful, if somewhat strange care from his old friends. He remembered how Kaylin used to shove food into his mouth whenever he was absorbed in his research, making it impossible for him to refuse. Now, along with the sisters Roa and Ahri and Hipopo, they headed to the camp's dining hall. The two sisters explained to Rust how the dining hall worked. Noticing that Hipopo wanted to eat too, Rust used his alchemy to turn some finely ground magic stones into a bowl of grass-like pellets. He smiled as he watched his pet eagerly clean the bowl. Just then, the two sisters returned with their trays of food. Rust looked at the dishes before him and realized the menu was very simple, but he could tell the cook had tried their best to improve the flavor, despite the limited ingredients. Rust asked the sisters if everyone in the camp ate here, and they replied that those with families usually ate together in their own homes. Looking around, the scene in the dining hall reminded Rust of his days at the academy. He took out a scroll and began to review his findings. However, he quickly noticed the two sisters staring at him, as if they wanted to say something. Rust asked the sisters if they had noticed any common link between the patients and the new cases from today. Ahri heard him but told him he should stop working while he was eating. Still, she reported that she hadn't heard of any new cases today. Roa, on the other hand, thought about his question and replied that she'd noticed most of the patients were single. Hearing that, it clicked for Ari too, and she added that those people were usually found in the tent area for those living alone. Rust mulled over this information and then asked if a lot of single people ate at the camp's dining hall. Ahri nodded, confirming that was correct. Rust summoned a scroll, which displayed an interface like a computer, a unique invention of his. With a confident smile, he announced, "I've found the answer." Then he told the two sisters to stop eating immediately, explaining that the food contained a small amount of a poison that affects the nervous system, which matched the patient's symptoms. Hearing this, Roa and Ari immediately shouted a warning to the others in the dining hall, telling everyone to stop eating, and announcing that the food might be poisoned. Meanwhile, Rust was still absorbed in searching for information on his scroll, and finally found what he was looking for. However, his expression suddenly changed, a hint of doubt clouding his face, prompting the sisters to ask immediately, "What's wrong?" Rust quietly reviewed everything he had learned, as if verifying something important. He announced, "I think I've figured out part of the cause," leaving Roa and Ari stunned. Just then, the woman in charge of the kitchen appeared. Rust announced that he had figured out how the illness was spreading, making the head cook ask worriedly if there was a problem with the food. Rust introduced himself as an alchemist sent by Lady Kalin to investigate the illness spreading through the camp. He asked to inspect the kitchen, and upon arriving, he confirmed that the readings on his scroll were just as he had predicted. He asked Roa to inform Kalin and to arrange a meeting within 1 hour. 1 hour later, Rust, Kalin, Roa, Ari, the head cook, and the manager of the singles tent all gathered for a discussion. Rust, with a serious expression, was ready to share his findings about the illness and how it spread. Lady Kalin began the meeting by saying she heard Rust had solved the plague. Rust, with a calm demeanor, began to explain the source of the illness. He said it originated from the lake upstream of the river near the camp, where the toxin of a monster that once lived there directly affects the nervous system. Kalin confirmed that they did indeed use water from the river, but she believed it shouldn't be an issue, as the water jug used for storage was equipped with a toxin purifying function. Rust agreed that the jug was doing its job perfectly in purifying the drinking water. However, the problem was with the water used for other daily needs like washing clothes and dishes, which was being drawn directly from the river without any purification. This left both the manager of the singles tent and the head of the kitchen in shock. They never suspected that using unpurified water for such tasks was the main cause of the illness's spread. Rust, with his clear explanation, shed light on the entire issue, making everyone realize the seriousness of the situation. Rust continued, explaining that he had investigated the singles tent and found a small amount of the monster's toxin on the eating utensils and washed clothes. This small amount of toxin entered the body through skin contact or ingestion, which explained why so many patients were from the singles tent. Hearing this, the head cook and the tent manager were deeply ashamed and wanted to take responsibility for what had happened. However, Lady Kalin immediately stopped them, saying she was the one who decided on the water allocation. She explained that the purified water had to be rationed due to limited supply, and therefore she took full responsibility and placed no blame on them. Kalin, with her responsible leadership, reassured them both, while Rust watched silently, realizing the depth of how she managed and protected her people. He felt that Lady Kalin was not just a strong leader, but also a very compassionate one. Lady Kalin raised her hand with the air of a true leader, declaring that their next mission was to exterminate the monster living upstream, to eliminate the source of the toxin. Rust, with a faint smile, unexpectedly revealed that the monster had already been taken care of. It was the same creature that had attacked the white lizard earlier. He held up the monster's remains as proof, leaving everyone in the tent stunned. However, Rust just scratched his head modestly and said it was merely a coincidence. He checked his scroll and found no contradictions in his findings, which further solidified his confidence in his conclusion. Lady Kalin reviewed all the impressive achievements Rust had accomplished, completing treatment for all patients in just 1 day, finding the source of the illness the next, and even taking down the monster that caused it all. Rust went on to advise everyone that, since the monster had only recently been defeated, they still needed to monitor and test the water source to ensure no traces of the toxin remained in the system. He stressed the importance of maintaining hygiene and managing the water supply in the coming days. Rust advised everyone not to use water from the river without purification for a while, and to carefully dispose of water used for laundry or washing dishes. He continued to explain that in just a few more days, once the water source had stabilized and was free of any traces of the toxin, they could use the water directly without worry. Rust, with the utmost professionalism, bowed to Lady Kalin, declaring that he had completed his mission of treating the patients and completely resolving the illness that had burdened the camp. Kalin smiled brightly, thanking him for the wonderful job he had done, which far exceeded her greatest expectations. However, Rust reminded them that since the illness accumulated over time from small amounts of the toxin, there was still a chance some people might continue to show symptoms. Rust told Kalin he would continue to treat him and be ready to act if new cases arose. His advice, coupled with his dedication, helped everyone feel more at ease. Rust told Kalin he would continue to treat people according to their condition and requested that anyone who felt unwell should come see him immediately. Kalin agreed, acknowledging that he had truly become a vital part of the camp. Taking this opportunity, Rust decided to make a strategic move, asking Kalin if she had any plans to expand the water purification jug. He suggested that he could do it, provided he was given the necessary budget. Without a moment's hesitation, Kalin, with the demeanor of a decisive leader, approved his request. With that, the young alchemist's first mission in the camp officially came to a close, a mission he had completed with flying colors. Rust, despite becoming well known in the camp for his talent and dedication, remained calm. He looked forward to enjoying life on the frontier, although he wasn't exactly optimistic about the challenges that might lie ahead. Nevertheless, he knew he had made a memorable start, both as an alchemist and as a friend to Kalen. Rust, in a somber tone, narrated to himself that at this point he had no idea what kind of trouble was brewing at the Alchemists Association. Meanwhile, Ahri placed her charm on her face, beginning a new day in her role as the narrator. She reintroduced herself by name and explained her role as a servant to Lady Kalen, under the domain of the Admiral. Outside, on Porcelain Street, Roa was waiting for his younger sister. When Ahri arrived, Roa asked for her opinion on Master Rust. Meanwhile, Ahri, still in her narrator role, revealed that their task for the day was to buy a new water jug for the young alchemist. Returning to Roa's question, Ahri replied that she found Rust to be different from others from the very first moment she met him. The answer gave Roa pause, while Ahri continued to analyze Rust's role in the mission and his importance to Lady Kalen and the camp. Ahri remarked that she had sensed Rust's incredible combat power from the moment she met him, a strength that far surpassed both of them combined. As they walked together down Porcelain Street, Ahri said that she and Roa were the strongest among those who served Lady Kalen, but she thought Roa was having mixed feelings about the young alchemist. She analyzed that Roa felt a mix of admiration and jealousy for Rust's power. Roa, who had always been proud of the harsh training the two sisters had endured, was also starting to develop an interest in alchemy, a type of power completely different from what they knew. Ahri contemplated praising her younger sister for that attitude, but couldn't, because deep down, she felt the same way as Roa. As these thoughts swirled in her mind, the two sisters finally arrived at the magic shop, where they would find a new water flask for Rust. Ahri considered keeping her own mixed feelings a secret. After finishing their business at the magic shop, the two sisters continued to the next store Rust had told them to visit. On the way, they noticed the atmosphere on the street seemed more tense, completely different from the vibe on Porcelain Street. Despite sensing the difference, the two sisters decided to pay it no mind and continued towards the shop. As they stepped inside, they were greeted by the young-looking shopkeeper whom Rust had mentioned earlier as part of their task to check on the store. Ahri looked around and noticed that there were more empty shelves than magical items. The two sisters began discussing amongst themselves that they had some things they wanted to sell, which caught the shopkeeper's attention. She immediately asked who had sent them, her eyes curious yet wary. Ahri noticed the shopkeeper's gaze was sizing them up, and she guessed it might be because they didn't look like typical alchemists. To clear up any suspicion, she presented a sealed scroll. When the shopkeeper opened it and saw Master Rust's seal, she looked surprised. The sisters explained that Rust had instructed them to sell his products at this store. The shopkeeper happily agreed, as she knew Rust's potions were always of very high quality. However, she also hesitated because, in the message, Rust requested that they be sold at the normal price. The shopkeeper explained that currently the supply of alchemy products from the Alchemist Guild had been mysteriously disrupted, causing the prices of all alchemy-related items to skyrocket. She went on to say that Rust's potions could easily be sold for many times their normal price. Although she understood this, she still respected Rust's request, recognizing the difference in his approach to the market and the trust he placed in her. Ahri insisted that selling them at the normal price was enough, and the shopkeeper didn't object, understanding their position. As they stepped outside, the two sisters realized that even after selling at the normal price, their coin purse was still quite heavy. This reminded them that Rust had allowed them to use a portion of the money to cover their travel expenses. Excited by this idea, they decided to eat at a place that was fancier than usual. During the meal, Roa was especially enjoying the food, eating with a satisfied expression. Meanwhile, Ahri was lost in thought about how this chain of events had begun. She recalled that a few days ago, Lady Kalen had requested healers to come and check on the illness that was spreading through the camp. However, none of them stayed for long, as they were afraid of becoming infected themselves. That forced Kalen to find another solution, which ultimately led to summoning Master Rust to the camp. Ahri felt as if everything had been predestined, with Rust becoming the key to solving all their problems. Ahri reminisced about the moment Master Rust arrived at their camp like a miracle. She remembered the task of bringing the patients to Rust, most of whom couldn't walk normally due to the illness. She also couldn't forget the miraculous change as the patient's health improved immediately after leaving Rust's tent. Furthermore, Ahri recalled how Rust discovered the cause of the illness and destroyed the monster responsible for everything. In her eyes, Rust was unlike any other alchemist, He was someone special, far beyond any of the ordinary alchemists she had ever witnessed. Ahri suddenly told Roa that perhaps it was time they told Rust about the special ability of their eyes. This statement made Roa stop eating, her eyes wide with surprise. The two sisters faced each other without a word, but it was clear they both understood that revealing this secret was not an easy decision. In their silence, they reached an agreement, ready to face the decision to reveal the secret of their eyes to Rust. Meanwhile, at the Alchemist Guild, Rialzam looked particularly more irritable than usual. He stared at the guild's equipment warehouse in frustration, unable to believe his eyes. The place was covered in a slimy substance, giving off a foul stench. His job was to clean it all up. Rialzam complained, blaming Rust for suddenly leaving the guild. He grumbled that Rust hadn't been fully dedicated to the guild. Right now, the Alchemist Guild was in turmoil, forcing most of the master alchemists to leave and handle other matters. Inside the warehouse, most of the items were extremely dangerous and required careful handling. Some monster materials could even explode if not stored properly, adding to the stress and pressure Rialzam was facing. He sighed, thinking about the days when things in the guild were still normal, before everything fell into chaos. Previously, this place had a dedicated manager, but he was laid off due to budget cuts. After that, the basic research department took over. But that department was also disbanded, leading to the hazardous materials being neglected, and problems began to arise. In particular, an explosion from the fluid of a corpse-eating slime had caused serious chaos. Rialzam raised his fist in anger because the regulation for Level 1 hazardous materials forbade anyone from entering the warehouse except for master-level alchemists. If it weren't for this rule, he would have sent a subordinate in to take his place long ago. Just then, a voice called out, repeatedly shouting his name, signaling that there was trouble. Rialzam, still busy dealing with the mess, tried to ignore it and replied that he was busy. However, the young man named Tortake was insistent, stressing that the matter needed immediate attention, forcing Rialzam to heed the warning. The vice president of the Arms Association was screaming, demanding that someone summon Master Rialzam immediately. Shocked that his superior was looking for him personally, Rialzam turned and scolded Tortake for not saying so sooner, then ordered him to find a master-level alchemist to finish cleaning the storage. However, Tortake tried to argue, but it was no use. Rialzam, with an air of arrogance, quickly left to meet the vice president, despite being extremely annoyed about having to appear in such a disheveled state. As he walked, he grumbled that he couldn't possibly ask a master alchemist to do this cleanup job, especially since no one knew when they would be back. Meanwhile, he realized that the immediate priority was to close the warehouse door before the magical elements in the air could get in and cause more trouble. Rialzam, though reluctant, understood that this was the only way to limit the damage for now. Rialzam reached out, but a strict regulation stopped him, barring him from entering the storage without a master alchemist medallion. With nothing else he could do, he decided to go to the guild's entrance and wait for a master-level alchemist to return from their journey. In his immaturity and inexperience, Rialzam left without realizing that he had just left the magical elements in the air, completely free to enter the storage. This not only increased the risk of serious trouble, but also further complicated the situation within the guild.